History of Lacrosse on the Prairie. Alan Childs is a researcher and historian of the sport of lacrosse in the Midwest. His book, Minnesota Lacrosse to History, focuses on the roots of lacrosse in the Ojibwe and Dakota communities up to the early Midwest lacrosse. Mr. Childs lives in Savage, Minnesota with his wife and 5 children, who play, coach, and teach lacrosse at all levels. Alors, la troisième et finale conférence qui ce matin sera donnée par M. J. Alan Childs, et il va discuter l'histoire de la lacrosse sur le Prairie. M. Childs est chercheur et historien sur le sport de lacrosse dans le Midwest. Son livre Minnesota Lacrosse History se concentre sur les racines de lacrosse dans les communautés Ojibwe et Dakota jusqu'au début de lacrosse dans le Midwest. M. Childs reste à Savage, en Minnesota, avec sa femme et 5 enfants qui sont joueurs, entraîneurs et enseignants de lacrosse à tout niveau. Alan?
Good morning. I'm going to be talking about a part of the lacrosse history that isn't well known. The East Coast and West Coast gets a lot of credit for their participation and growth of the sport. The Midwest, a lot of us don't even know our own history when it comes to lacrosse. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today is primarily those areas in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Manitoba, those type of areas that lacrosse is where I'm from. The origins of lacrosse, obviously a lot happens around the cradle of lacrosse, the St. Lawrence River Valley. And that's where a lot of the stories come from, where it really is fostered as a sport. And as you see some of these other areas around here, you can see Minnesota's on the west side of the Great Lakes. And if you look through some of the things, Minnesota happens to be the home of 3 major rivers, the headwaters. So the Red River that runs into Manitoba originates in Minnesota, the Mississippi River originates in Minnesota, and the St. Lawrence River originates in Minnesota. So that's part of our story here. Next. So back in the archives, museums in Minnesota, the Ojibwe have a migration story. And the Ojibwe are part of the Algonquin family living out in New Brunswick, Newfoundland. About 900 AD, they decide to migrate west. And so that's part of their story. And as they do that, they follow along the river, the St. Lawrence River, coming into contact with the people of the Longhouse Six Nations, meeting with them, friendly at first. Then the Six Nations encourage them along to continue to move west. William Morin, who is a Ojibwe author, documents these confrontations, battles, and talks about how they migrated over a 500-year time frame into this area, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and even into Manitoba as well. So the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, a number of different names that they're known by, that's the basic part of their story. And they were told back on the Atlantic Ocean that they needed to move to where food grew on water. And that reference to the Minnesota Ojibwe is wild rice. And so when they found wild rice, is what grows on the lakes in Minnesota, that's how they knew they were home. And that's how they basically brought that here. William Morin documents in his trials, in the trails here, how they're playing lacrosse. Sault Ste. Marie, lots of areas that are going on, and those games are well documented at the time, playing the creator's game. And they're playing with a very different stick, a very different style, and we'll get to that. Stuart Cullen also wrote quite a bit about this as an archivist at the Smithsonian, about the different styles of the sticks. The creator's game is also known as the medicine game. And it's basically, in some of the early context, the stick, a lot that you'll see from the Western Great Lakes style, is this style, where it is a circle, very similar to the medicine wheel. So the medicine wheel, used for healing in the First Nation Native community, followed that style. And some of the original sticks have that 4-section to them. So you can see they were very much tied into the medicine game, very much part of the healing of the community. And as you hear and listen to their stories, they talk very much about this. Obviously, the sticks evolved, but you'll see a lot of this context here to the medicine wheel and the concepts of the medicine game. So even in Dr. Beer's original work, so in his first book, Lacrosse, the National Game of Canada, he has a sketch from the Ojibwe that he had seen. That stick right there with the 4 sections on it. And that's in his original book. That is the stylings that he saw for the Ojibwe stick. And he documented the use of that stick in games. Now, he preferred the Mohawk game. So that was very much what he preferred. So he went off of that. And the Six Nations may or may not have used that, I don't know. But they certainly evolved their sticks over time. You see a lot of transformations going through the Six Nations and the different styles that they used. This particular stick was one that I found in the Minnesota archives that some of the Minnesota lacrosse players used. That is the Six Nations style right here. Brian Laramie did a great job of research. He's a Choctaw Seminole artist, and you may have seen this picture all over the internet, and it's used everywhere. It's in Jim Calder's book. Just a tremendous job of research in looking at all of the different styles of the native sticks. And you'll see the varieties with the Cherokee, Choctaw, they use the 2-stick style. And then you'll see some of the other single sticks, Menominee, and then the longer styles, the Six Nations styles from the various groups. But you also see in the middle there, the Minnesota Ojibwe, and you'll see that it says it's the longest or oldest surviving stick, 1823 on this painting. And that was the research that he had found was the oldest stick that he could find that still existed, and we'll get to why it still exists. In and around the Midwest, there's a number of places that still hold a number of just, you can tell the game was big because things are named after it. So there's La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is named after the game because Lieutenant Pike saw games being played there and documented it in his journal. And the town, when they formed it, decided to take his name of La Crosse, Wisconsin, right on the Mississippi River. You'll also see up in Minnesota, lakes, we got 10,000 of them. One of them is called Ball Club Lake. Ball Club Lake, up near Leech Lake Reservation, is where every spring the annual games would be played. And so they would travel in, this is part of the Mississippi River, and they would travel in by canoe, horseback, and continue to play games there up until the 1940s. So a very long time period, but those areas still exist. I went up there, and people are only somewhat aware of, like, why do we have a road called La Crosse Shores Road up in the middle of northern Minnesota? And it's just really kind of died out. But those things are still around the community and around the area, and it's quite interesting.
I guess there's no questions about Leech Lake, what that might mean.
No. One of the main things that happened in the U.S. history was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Thomas Jefferson purchased the land west of the Mississippi, sent out Lewis and Clark. Hey, they found a great place at the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers coming together and said we should build a fort there. And the purpose of that fort was to protect against the British at the time on the northern side for the fur trade. And so Lieutenant Pike was sent in 1805 to acquire the land from the Dakota who lived there and basically set up a place to build a fort. So Fort Snelling is what was built there. And that Minnesota-Mississippi River is known as Bedode to the Dakota. It's very sacred ground. If you can kind of think in their stories, that's where life begins on Turtle Island. To them, that's their Garden of Eden. So it's a very special place to them, and I encourage you to read about it. They have some amazing stories of what that represents to them. But because of the rivers, it's a great place for trade. So fur traders, everybody else is going to come to those two rivers, Mississippi and Minnesota. So it's great for the fur trading business, and that's what they established there. So forts draw a lot of people, especially explorers. And the one explorer that we're going to talk about is Beltrami. So Giacomo Constantino Beltrami, an Italian explorer. And he comes to the fort before it's finished in 1823. The fort's finished in 1825. And he wants to find the headwaters of the Mississippi. Where does the Mississippi begin? So Minnesota's not a state yet. It's just a territory. There's a fort here. There aren't many civilians allowed to live in the area. So he's traveling up. And what he does is he makes it all the way up to Red Lake, Minnesota. He actually goes past the headwaters, but he kind of misses it, so he doesn't get credit for this. But what he does get credit for is he trades. He trades for a number of things. And one of the things he trades for is a Red Lake lacrosse stick. And this is a replica of that stick. So this stick was picked up by him in 1823 as he went up the Mississippi, and then he went back down to New Orleans and then, caught back to Italy and took it home with him. And it sits today, and that is an actual picture of it in the museum in Bergamo, Italy. So the original stick is not even on North America, Turtle Island. It doesn't exist here. It's just really unfortunate. So I encourage Red Lake to get this stick back. But you'll see that he traded for a number of things. So you'll see he actually got a canoe from them. He got a lacrosse ball. You'll see a number of drumsticks, things that are in his canoe there. You actually see a drawing of the stick in there as well. And this was kind of what he had done. And if you go up to northern Minnesota, there's Beltrami County. There's all things named after him up there. It's quite amazing what he had discovered up in that part of northern Minnesota. But that's the story of this stick. So back to Brian Laramie's picture, you're looking at this is what he saw and researched and said this is the oldest stick that he could find that was still in existence, that actually physically exists. And we're lucky because it made it to a museum right away. It immediately made it back with Beltrami. Unlike other sticks, it's made out of wood. It's going to deteriorate very quickly. So we're very lucky to have this stick still around. Hope to get it back. All right, other artists that came. George Catlin, you might know about him. He painted a lot of the famous pictures of lacrosse out on the plains and the prairie. He visited a number of times to Fort Snelling. He first started at Fort Gibson, where the player on the left is Choctaw. And he started there on his journeys and painted him with the two-stick style game in complete dress. When Catlin painted a lot of Native American paintings, they were always full dress for him, always put on a good show for him. The other two are Dakota. And he saw them at Fort Snelling. And the one on the far right, he who stands on two sides, was his favorite player. He said he was the best player. And he stood out dramatically, and that's why he put him into this particular painting. And if you ever get to see the original of this, most of the pictures you see don't do justice to the brilliant color of this. I was lucky enough to see it at the Minnesota Historical Society. They had the original tour through, and it is brilliant in color. And if you get a chance to see it in person, definitely do that. The fort held a number of games actually in Catlin's honor. So they would bring in the Dakota and the Ojibwe during trading time in the spring, and they would fire off the cannon and do all sorts of things, 4th of July celebrations. There's a number of games documented there. And that's where he was able to sit down and really try and observe and watch these lacrosse games getting played between the nations. And as the treaties would form and there would be allotments given out, they would gamble for those allotments. So they'd receive $2,000 and then boom, it went right there on the block for a game. And they would do that. Another Fort Snelling person. So it just keeps rolling here. Fort Snelling's commander, Seth Eastman, for a time, he was an artist. And he depicted a number of things about the Dakota in the area. Their villages, how they lived, those type of things. And his wife, Mary, wrote many stories and published books about Dakota life. And what they did was they captured lacrosse games. And lacrosse was even played in the winter with the Dakota and the Ojibwe. And so this is basically on the Minnesota River. And if you know Minnesota, if you ever go to the Mall of America, 2 miles south of there is where this is. So I found the place where I have found an historian who told me where Drifters Village was and where Seth painted this painting. And so it's literally 2 miles south, and there's a park there where he painted this painting. But it is the Dakota, and you can see in the bottom left, there's some items that they're gambling for, a little collection down there, and they're playing this game, a couple of broken sticks in the painting as well, but they're playing on the ice. It's Minnesota, you know, just like Canada, things freeze up and you just go out and play your game. And so they did that as well. So they played more often in spring, but things get boring. They go out on the ice. You got to entertain yourself in the winter as well, and they did that quite a bit. Minnesota is home to 11 native reservations. And it has quite a culture and history with the Ojibwe and the Dakota. The Ojibwe moved into northern Minnesota, and the Dakota remain in southern Minnesota. And the Dakota also got pushed out to the Dakotas and other places with the 1862 Dakota War, other things that happened there. A really tragic part of history for Minnesota. For those that don't know, we actually had the record of the largest assassination of Native people. 38 men were hung at one time in Mankato, Minnesota, at the direction of Abraham Lincoln, at the end of the way to end the 1862 war. So it's a rough part of our history that they're still healing from, and they still talk about it and still try and get this back. And so the Creators game kind of died out, but this is where they're currently located in these areas: Prairie Island, Red Lake, Mille Lacs, Leech Lake, White Earth. We'll go over a couple of pictures here. But just, you know, Fort Snelling is down here near the Twin Cities, down in that area is where they're located. And then also Pipestone on the left. If you're not familiar with Pipestone, Minnesota, Pipestone is where the red clay is. Have you ever seen a peace pipe made out of red clay? It's actually a U.S. national monument there. And only the local tribes are allowed to mine that red clay for their own purposes, for artwork and for their pipes. And that still exists today. But you can visit it, but you're not allowed to take any of the red clay. Very holy ground. So as I traveled up to northern Minnesota and on my way to Winnipeg and the Manitoba Archives, it's remarkable how many pictures are just sitting there in museums that people don't know a lot of the stories. So Red Lake, 1910. This is just sitting on the wall. No story, no ideas, just sitting there on the wall. Yeah, that must have happened here. You know, just not a lot of information, obviously not documented in newspapers or other things like that. The native game really has, you know, been lost that way. And you'll see also boarding schools are well underway in Minnesota, Wisconsin, the US by this point. And you'll see some of the assimilation already going on. They're dressed like white settlers. They've got the hats, they've got the look. They're looking like white settlers at this point by 1910. Another one is White Earth, the White Earth Reservation. And again, you know, this is prior to World War I. Don't know exactly when this was taken, but basically right up there on the walls in these museums, there's these guys that played lacrosse. And they're on these reservations, and all they have is, yep, that's White Earth. So there's still a lot to be researched and found out about what happened here in the Midwest. But what we do know is Dr. Beers put together some rules. 1867, brought the game to life with a set structure, and he got the Shamrocks here put together with a really good team. And one of the players, John Flannery, on the left in the middle there, and he moved to the United States. He had a job with Standard Oil and got moved into Boston. So what does he do? He's very much a great believer in Dr. Beers' belief of the structure of lacrosse and that it's a great game, brings it to the U.S. and starts to follow a Canadian immigration into the United States. So, you know, the Canadians are moving into the Midwest, they're moving into San Francisco of all places, but they're starting to fill in throughout the country. And so what he does is he sets up the United States National Amateur Lacrosse Association, 1879. And of course, he's the first coach, and of course, he moved to Boston. He wins the first 2 national titles. One thing that's interesting is this is organized in Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, I did not know this, is kind of the hub of sports at that time. U.S. tennis is starting at this time. U.S. golf is starting at this time. The Westminster Polo Club is located there. All of these sports are originating out of Newport, Rhode Island. Who knew? Then John moves to New York. New York takes the championship. And then a trend starts to happen. It starts to move west. Louisville, Kentucky wins it the next year. Calumets of Chicago win it the following year. And then the next 2 years, St. Paul, Minnesota takes it. And so it's transitioned from East Coast to Midwest now, and they're playing for a cup, which I wish I would even know the existence of it, but it was a challenge cup, much like other trophies at the time. And so you had to challenge for it. So St. Paul held on to it. St. Paul in 1885 took a rail station or a rail car and traveled all over the East Coast. So they went out to Long Island and Manhattan, Detroit. They went up to Toronto. They went up to Montreal and played a number of games. And they won all of the U.S. games, but they did not win the Canadian games. So they remained U.S. champions, but not an international champion. The big story that I wrote in the book that was quite interesting is New York got tired of the cup being in the Midwest. They got tired of the championship being in the Midwest. So they basically got on their train, went out to Minnesota and challenged for the cup and won it in 1886. Very controversial. Back then, you provided your own officials. So New York brought an official, Minnesota brought an official, and this is when we're still working with flag poles. So, of course, that ball goes sailing by the posts, and the New York official says, good, and the crowd and everybody else is like, wide. It's like, so a big controversy ensues, a lot of fights going on, but New York ends up taking the cup back and bringing it back. And then the league gets mauled in a lot of different controversies, and it really just kind of ends in 1888. Just lasts a decade is all that it lasts. So here's a picture of the St. Paul, Minnesota 1883 team. This was the very first team in Minnesota. Basically white settlers, mostly Canadian, okay? And this is still when the mustaches are going. They're going good here. This is the Canadian mustache at its peak here. I think before the 1900s, this is it. Now, one of the reasons was because of Dr. Beer's rules that, in Section 9, Rule 9, it's no Indian shall play without the consent of the other team. Well, the philosophy at the time is that First Nation Native Americans can't grow facial hair. So, to prove that you're not cheating, you grew a mustache. That was one of the trends. And so you'll see the Shamrocks and everybody else in this time frame, those mustaches are in full gear, especially the Crescents, the Brooklyn Crescents and the others. There's some great stashes. Definitely jealous of that time frame. The other thing that's going on is, so in Minnesota, it's Decoration Day, now known as Memorial Day, but they would have celebrations, fundraisers to do these trips. And so one of the things they did was throwing the lacrosse ball. So down here in this section, you'll see the contestants, and then the winner over here is basically 104 yards written on the program. So I was able to find an original program from 1884 with the results written on it from the officials. And so haven't seen that come back anymore, any tournaments or anything that I've been to, but throwing the lacrosse ball the longest, that's maybe a tradition we might need to bring back. So outdoor lacrosse games, goalposts, you'll see them in here barely, with some flags at the top. They're barely visible, but just kind of playing on the state fair grounds. Minnesota has a great state fair tradition going back to 1858, and a lot of games were played at the state fair. So the white settlers played there, and even the Ojibwe and Dakota played at the state fairgrounds quite a bit. One of the trends that went on, the US is popular for this. I don't know as much about Canadian history, but we love our crazes. So a couple of crazes that went through Minnesota in the 1880s, 1890s, and it went through most of the US as well. Roller skating starts in the 1880s, big, huge craze. They build all these roller rinks, throughout the country. Minnesota, of course, we like to claim we've got the biggest of everything, biggest mall, biggest roller rink, okay? So that dies off pretty quick. People get tired of skating in a circle, so they try and create some sports, and it's eventually actually how hockey gets started in Minnesota is something called ice polo, but we won't get into that today. But basically, we go through a bicycle craze, we go through a boxing craze, and then we've got unused things like this. And this is how we start practicing for the summer, because we got short summer. So we start practicing lacrosse indoors, basically around 1905, 1906. We start practicing indoors. There's no indoor game created yet. So the Canadians hadn't figured out till the 1930s that there was going to be a box style coming in. But basically this was used for developing skills, and a lot of indoor lacrosse was played, but never really games. It was there to prepare you for that short spring and summer season of lacrosse. So the relationship is at times pretty decent with the Native community. One of the things that happened was when St. Paul had the championship for lacrosse, the Chippewas challenged for the national championship. And they wanted to play the St. Paul team, which had the National Cup at the time. This is in 1885, I believe. And Chippewa, there's a lot of bludgeoning of the name. So, the Ojibwe call themselves Anishinaabe, but Ojibwe got pretty popular, then it was Ojibwa, then it was Chippewa. So it just kind of melted down over time. So you'll actually still see on the treaties it says Chippewa, even though it's referred to as Ojibwe. So if you get the confusion, it's just a mangling of names over time. But so just a little sketch of what it looked like of a Dakota player at that time. But the game was not allowed because they used very different style sticks, and St. Paul didn't want to lose. So where did our Minnesota, and then Manitoba teams kind of get their sticks? Well, they got them from basically where everybody else did. Lallys, out of Cornwall. And so you'll see a number of times where they're waiting to start their season because the Lallys order hasn't come in yet. and they're talking about getting their sticks there. And I was lucky enough to get into the Minnesota archives, and they actually have several sticks there. And they didn't even know what these were or who these players were, but there's a Lallys special sitting in there with John Stark's name engraved on it, one of the players from the championship team. And then George Curvin as well has the Duke's special Lallys lacrosse stick sitting in the archives, just sitting in a bin, going, wow. They didn't even have a picture of it, and nobody labeled it because they didn't know what it was. So as I worked with them, we've got pictures taken now, and it's gotten up onto the website so that people can be aware of what's really in some of those archives. And we don't even know where it got donated from. It just ended up in the archives. So there's more out there to find. It's kind of my message. Lacrosse was also popular before baseball games. So it's America, we're playing baseball. So baseball's starting up, and so to get more crowds, lacrosse games would get moved to be before baseball games. So the St. Paul Saints, sitting in the dugout over there, that's our St. Paul Saints team, and then our lacrosse team plays right before it. And they also took on the name the Saints. So they were also the St. Paul Saints for a period of time. They called themselves that. But you can see the style sticks. Mustaches are starting to taper off a little bit, not as many now. Also, before hockey really starts to take over, we're playing lacrosse outside on ice. And this is actually the only picture I could find it's actually a painting, of lacrosse being played on ice at the Montreal tank. And so our newspaper accounts talk about taking lacrosse outside on the ice, skating and playing on the ice. And you can see there's a big band playing over here. I mean, this obviously is quite a spectacle. I don't know of any teams or organizations or anything else. It just kind of describes that they were playing outside, for the entertainment of the crowds. Again, to like Bruce's point earlier, there wasn't a lot of sporting events to go to. And if you could do something local, you can get people to attend. The Olympics. The Olympics are a great story. And this one really surprised me quite a bit as I learned about it. We knew that it was the Manitoba or Winnipeg Shamrocks that had won the first gold medal in lacrosse. What had happened on the US side is everything had kind of fallen apart that particular year. So it's still an amateur game at this point in the US. Everything's amateur. There's some professional going on in Canada, but it's supposed to be, if you're in the US Lacrosse League, you're supposed to be amateur, not paid. The Brooklyn Crescents, who were probably the best team at the time, I'd like to argue St. Paul was pretty much a rival to them, but they were caught cheating with professional players, playing players, so they were not allowed to go to the Olympics. There was going to be a big playoff game to decide who was going to go to the Olympics for the US. After that failed, the Crescents kind of controlled all of the money. They pulled the travel money, and so the other teams didn't get a chance to play off, and they let St. Louis represent the US, a local team where the Olympics were being held in St. Louis, and they were the ones that represented the US. Now, Montreal had found out about that Brooklyn wasn't going, so they called over to Winnipeg and said, yeah, send your team down. We don't really need to travel all that far to win the gold medal. So they believed that they were capable of doing it. On the way down, though, the Winnipeg Shamrocks offered to play the St. Paul team, which wanted to get to the Olympics but couldn't afford to do it. And they played to a 6-6 tie. So the Olympics, not that we've got coverage of it, might have had a more exciting game for that gold medal had St. Paul represented the US instead of the local St. Louis club. But that's the fair. It was tied into the 100-year celebration of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the Louisiana Purchase was in 1803. They're kind of off by a year. They fell behind. So they merged it with the Olympics that year. As these leagues kind of failed around the area, the US Lacrosse League failed, there was a revival about 1900. And so 1900, what you get is you move away from the poles and you get a net. So in 1900, the lacrosse net is invented. So now you've got a lacrosse net. And so there's a little bit of a revival, and there's a number of things contributing to this, because it's happening in Canada as well. But 1900 is when things start to kick up again. And so not having other teams to play, Manitoba is very generous and allows Minnesota, Chicago, and other areas, Duluth, to join the Western Canadian Lacrosse Association. And so they play for the Drury Cup. And this is what they compete for a number of years. Minnesota only won it once. Most of the time, it was some really, really good Manitoba teams that I'll show you here in a second. But they also competed once for the Hudson Bay Cup. So they would also go for the International Hudson Bay Cup. So those are pictures out of the newspaper in St. Paul of the trophies that made it to town. Manitoba at this time is flying big with great teams. They have tremendous players in the Winnipeg lacrosse area. The Surrey Club dominates for a number of years. And if you look at some of Surrey's history, they're very proud of this lacrosse heritage. It's all over town. They talk about this was their heyday. This is the time, 1905, 1906, 1907. This is the glory days in Winnipeg and Manitoba, for lacrosse. And, very similar to Canada and its league, this is the Western Canadian Association. Plum Creek, Sioux, Port Arthur, Thunder Bay, they all have teams in this league. They're all competing very heavily in this league. And it was really a fun time to be able to go back and forth. So there was a lot of travel involved, so eventually they moved it to the Midwest Northern team, Canadian team, would play the winner of the Upper Midwest US team, and they would come together for that championship to get that Drury Cup. So at first they played each other a lot, but it was a lot of hard traveling to make that happen. So end of Midwest lacrosse. So now we get to the sad stuff, as everything else has, lacrosse has gone through its glory days. One of the things that happened in the United States is football's trying to take hold. Baseball's taken hold, football's trying to take hold. Football in 1905 has 18 players die. 18 football players die in 1905. And this is a tremendous event because Northwestern University in Illinois says, we're canceling our football team. And they do. And we're replacing it with lacrosse. Okay? Big Ten votes and says, we're kicking football out of the Big Ten. And that passes. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. President Roosevelt jumps in, whose son's playing at Harvard, loves football, big football fan, says, okay, guys, we got to get our act together. Our football's going to stop and it's going to die. And this is American football, okay? And so what President Roosevelt does is he calls a commission and he gets 3 rule changes, Okay, so he gets a couple of things related to the line of scrimmage. But the one thing that he is able to do is, what's the most exciting play in lacrosse that no other sport has? And so he's like, what is this? What is this? Well, hockey at the time, soccer at the time, rugby continues this. You can only pass backwards. You cannot pass forward in any team sport except one, lacrosse. He takes that and puts it into football and says, we're going to pass over the defense. You can't do that in any other sport. You still can't do it in soccer. You still can't do it in rugby. You know, you can do it in football, in lacrosse. And so as you see this evolve, he's able to take that fun element and move it into football. And it's just something that really changed the game of football and really took hold, that football became America's sport. Similar to what I heard Bruce describe earlier, 1906, 2 Chicago teams playing in the WCLA, Western Canadian Lacrosse Association, have a major fight. Police are on the field. Spectators come on the field. Spectators brawl one another. Just completely destroys the confidence that they can grow this league. It's too violent. People are swinging sticks at each other's heads. There's no equipment to protect them. And it just is a bloody mess. And that's pretty much what ends it in the Midwest. This league ends on that note, unfortunately. This is a playoff game to see who's going to go play the Canadians for the championship. And Minnesota was going to play the winner of that game. But they never got to play that game because they just called that game and ended it and said, Canada, this is yours, and just let it go. And that league ended and they no longer participated in it. Now, also, the University of Minnesota, still trying to get the sport going. They hire a guy by the name of John Trout from Columbia University, captain of his lacrosse team, comes and coaches the University of Minnesota, 1911. So, you know, comes in, starts the program, really trying to get lacrosse to take hold because the people still fighting, saying they don't want football. So they come in and they start their lacrosse program. And then the first summer, after the first year, he dies on Lake Minnetonka trying to save a girl who's drowning in a canoe. And he loses his life, unfortunately. And they're not willing to replace the coach. And the program is run by the track coach the next year, but it basically dies off by 1912. And really unfortunate. So Minnesota's just tragic, one thing after another. World War I comes, takes a lot of people out. Boarding schools are also running here. Boarding schools in the US, basically English only, can't speak your native language, can't do any of the things that make you native. Lacrosse is ended in all schools. So they become baseball players. So they teach them all to play baseball. In fact, the first Minnesotan inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame is White Earth. And it's an unusual thing, but it's some of the best athletes come out of that native time for baseball. The GI Bill for the US basically allows the Ojibwe and Dakota soldiers to attend college. Hey, you get free college for participating in the war, and here you go. They don't come back to the reservation. It really did a number on them not coming back to teach anything else of those traditions. And so by the end of the 1940s, Red Lake, Leech Lake Ball Club, the sport's gone in Minnesota. It's just completely gone. And they're continuing to do a little bit up north in some articles as they continue to play up north in Manitoba, but it's slowly dying. It's just one of those unfortunate things. So I was going to end it there, but it's like, I can't end on such a sad note. So it's coming back. So the Oneida, part of the Six Nations, the Oneida kind of ended up on the short end of the stick. They fought for the Americans in the Revolution, while the Six Nations sided with the British or didn't take sides at all. And they were rewarded by getting kicked out of New York and sent to Wisconsin. So Dan Ninham, who's the Oneida, living in Wisconsin, gets a basketball scholarship, and if you meet this guy, you'll understand why. He's about 6'10", he towers over all of us, to Bemidji State University in Minnesota. And he starts to bring back the game. So he's got his Oneida team here. He starts running programs, old meets new in the 90s, starts bringing back, hey, this is our game, let's get it back into the community, goes to Red Lake, goes to Leech Lake, goes to all these other areas and starts teaching people that they need to bring this back. And so what has happened is it's being brought back on all of the reservations in the communities. So there's people in, like the Jackson family in Redwood Falls has been helping to bring it back. John Hunter in the Twin Cities Lacrosse Club is doing a great job. Randy Blackdeer in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. Matt Childs, no relation, in Prairie Island is bringing it back. And they travel hundreds of miles to go play the Creators game with each other. And you'll see that they're using their original style stick here, the Ojibwe style stick. And you'll see Dan towering over all of them in the back there. And then their post is there as well. So they play the single post game so that you have to touch the ball or shoot the ball to hit the post to be able to score. And that's basically the style that they play now. But it is coming back into the Native community, and these few families are doing a great job. Obviously, Minnesota has started with the youth and some other things as well to get the other games going. Girls actually started before boys, and there's more girls lacrosse than there is boys lacrosse in Minnesota. So that's the way that we've kind of brought it back a little bit. But we're up to maybe about 15,000 players right now that are kids that are doing this under the age of 18. So we're slowly getting it back there. And starting to cross the border again. So we have a number of teams that we play with from across the border, and our next thing is to bring in box lacrosse to get that, to help develop more skill and to continue that with the Canadians to the north of just continuing to grow the game that way as well. Learn more skills, very different game, but again, a very enjoyable game that everybody can share. That's what I got. Questions?
It's interesting that the game in Minnesota, it's sort of dying out at the same time as it is on the West Coast. It's almost exactly.
Yeah.
Not quite, but almost. And you had a number of reasons why. Were there any other contributors to why the game faltered?
Well, hockey obviously took over. So they're playing lacrosse on skates outside up until about 1910, and then Twin Cities Hockey Club starts, and the league started in 1911. And so in 1911, hockey takes over. And at that point, if you know your history at all, America had something called ice polo, and Canadians had ice hockey. And so they met in Niagara Falls for this big showdown. Who's got the best sport? And that was basically around 1908, 1909. I don't remember the exact year off the top of my head. But they met, and then, so Americans win the ice polo games, and and Canadians win the ice hockey games. Ice polo is played with like a bandy stick and a ball, a lacrosse ball. And so it was more wide open. But what the Americans conceded was hockey's better than ice polo, and said we're going to switch, and brought it back and said we're going to start leagues on ice hockey, and the Canadians have invented a better game than ice polo. So they admitted defeat in that. But that's how all of that started. And when they brought that home, everyone picked up ice hockey, and it just continued to grow. Baseball, very strong in Minnesota, in the Midwest, very, very strong. It goes back to the culture and what it's presenting. Baseball was very much America's sport. They claimed it was indigenous, and it's just like, when the indigenous sport is truly lacrosse.
I was interested in your throwing the lacrosse ball competition, because they certainly did that at Emmets in the 1900s, definitely 1904, probably much longer.
Yes.
But I don't know how far they threw, and not as far as your 104 yards.
But yeah, I think it's a fun part of the game, and maybe get some other competitions. We don't have many of those to kind of make it fun for the youth of like, what are some of the lacrosse skills that you could show off? And they've done a little bit in the MLL and NLL with some of the things that they do, but not a lot for some of those all-star competitions. Any others? All right, thank you.